North Country school districts are busy getting ready for the upcoming school year, and they're dealing with something they hadn't planned for: the Trump administration withholding already appropriated federal funding. That money supports all sorts of programs, like teacher trainings, after-school care, and adult literacy. We take a look at how school districts are grappling with how to respond on today's Story of the Day.
Support for Story of the Day comes from Pearsall Wealth Management at UBS Wealth Management USA, subsidiary UBS AG, member FINRA SIPC, 1 Broad Street, Glens Falls.
Hi, I'm Kara Chapman, and for David Summerstein, it's Thursday, July 17th. Up first, the Village of Lake Placid has canceled a public hearing and vote on a proposed law that would have required larger protests to obtain permits at least 5 days in advance. It would have applied to any public gathering of 25 people or more. The proposed law sparked backlash from locals. An online petition signed by more than 500 people claimed it would infringe on the public's right to free speech. In a post on Facebook yesterday announcing the canceled hearing and vote, the village said it never intended to limit free speech. The village thanked the community for its input and said local officials look forward to continued dialogue on the issue. Just days ago, President Trump's pick for the U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of New York appeared to be out of a job after a panel of federal judges declined to make his interim role permanent. Well, he's back, and Jung Yoon Han from the New York Public News Network has the latest.
Attorney General Pam Bondi appointed John Sarcone as acting U.S. Attorney back in March. It was a temporary move that had to be formalized by this week. He says he wants to be a tough-on-crime prosecutor. But after a series of controversies surrounding Sarcone's tenure, a panel of judges on Monday declined the Republican lawyer's bid for a permanent appointment. That same day, Bondi and the Department of Justice gave him a new appointment that effectively brings him back to the job for a region that includes Plattsburgh, Syracuse, and Albany. Carl Tobias, who teaches law at the University of Richmond, says it's notable that President Trump is, so far, not trying to get Sarcone officially nominated and confirmed through the Senate.
That's my concern here, is the process is not very regular. And it's cutting the Senate out of the process.
Federal judges could have permanently appointed Sarcone to the job. That is what happened in New York's Western District. But Tobias says federal judges in the Northern District specifically chose not to exercise that authority.
And I think the judges were trying to be fair and not have a confrontation with the DOJ or with President Trump. But at the same time, I think this was a vote of no confidence or little confidence.
Sarcone made headlines after an undocumented immigrant wielded a knife at him, and when Sarcone allegedly listed a boarded-up building as his residence in the district. Residency is required for the job. In Albany, I'm Jung Yoon Han for the New York Public News Network.
While students are enjoying their summer vacation, North Country superintendents and principals are planning for the upcoming school year, hiring new staff, making schedules, and finalizing programs. But this year, there's been a big wrench in that process. The Trump administration is currently holding on to nearly $7 billion in federal education funding. Schools that were counting on that money now find themselves in a tough spot. Amy Feiereisel reports on what that looks like in our region.
In New York, the withheld education funding amounts to about $460 million. The programs it supports are pretty wide-ranging, everything from teacher trainings to after-school care to adult GED and literacy programs. And that money is for this school year, as in the one starting about 6 weeks from now. Tom Burns is the superintendent of the St. Lawrence Lewis BOCES.
These are monies that, the schools expected to get. And so this was I think, just out of left field. It was a complete surprise.
These weren't proposed funds. They were passed by Congress in March and signed into law by President Trump himself. So Burns says schools wrote them into their budgets, which were voted on in May.
Districts don't really know what to do here. They'll need to figure out, do we run those programs?
Or do they close the programs in question and fire their staff? It's putting districts in a really tricky situation, says Cassidy Matamore, the supervisor of Title I services at the St. Lawrence Lewis BOCES. The metaphorical train has already left the station.
The budgets are already set, players are in place, schedules are being worked on.
While federal funds are the smallest share of a school budget, usually between 2% and 8%, depending on the district, Matamore says they are significant.
It contributes greatly to the education that we're able to provide.
She says in St. Lawrence and Lewis counties, the funds currently being withheld are used for things like literacy coaches and math tutors, social workers and counselors, and specialty courses on the high school level. She says this is a big part of how districts provide for their neediest students, and that's who she's worried about losing out.
The students that struggle, they have a tough hand that they've been dealt with, and we want to provide them as much support as we can. Those are the students that we really try to look out for through the use of title funds.
Here's what's happening on the national level. The Trump administration says the funding is under review to make sure it is, quote, spent in accordance with the president's priorities, end quote. Democrats say withholding the money is illegal because it was already appropriated by Congress. New York Senator Kirsten Gillibrand said in a press conference last week that the president is taking money from people who can't fight back.
They just want to give tax breaks to billionaires, and they need to find money. And they just know that lower income, less educated, rural students don't have the political clout to push back.
When asked if she supported the federal funding being withheld from North Country districts, Republican Congresswoman Elise Stefanik responded with a statement accusing New York State of cutting school funding for years with, quote, barely a peep from the deranged taxpayer media, end quote. A quick fact check there. Over the past 4 years, total per-pupil spending in New York has grown by about 20%, and the state share has increased year over year. Stefanik also called on Governor Kathy Hochul, quote, to use all funds for education for illegals to instead rightfully go to lawful New York families. Another fact check, individual districts apply for title funds and decide how they will be used, not the state. But Stefanik's statement seemed to echo one made by an official from the Federal Office of Management and Budget, who claimed some of the withheld federal funding has been used in the past to support a, quote, radical left-wing agenda and promote illegal immigrant advocacy organizations. No specifics or examples were provided. That narrative really bothers Dale Brialt, the superintendent of the Franklin Essex Hamilton BOCES.
I'm really frustrated with the fact that the narrative coming out of Washington surrounding why they are withholding these funds doesn't really match the reality of how the funds are being used here in the North Country.
He pointed to one of the programs being targeted for English language learners. He says that's getting used in places like Lake Placid and Saranac Lake, where businesses are recruiting foreign service workers for the tourism industry.
On legitimate, appropriate work visas, oftentimes they come with their children who then are enrolled in schools who do need assistance in leveling them up in terms of the English language.
And much of the withheld funding has nothing to do with immigrant children or services they might receive. For example, funding for teacher trainings and professional development, or Century 21 grants, a program many North Country districts are using to provide after-school programming. In the Colton-Pierpont district in St. Lawrence County, that program provides 30 kids with homework support, a snack, recess time, and supervision while their parents are still at work. That's pretty critical, says James Nee, the district superintendent.
You've probably heard or run stories about our child care desert. There's very few certified daycare providers within our region.
He says if that funding stays withheld, they would be hard-pressed to continue the program.
If that went away, you have 30 students and their families trying to figure out what after-school care would look like.
Nee was actually one of about 20 superintendents from New York who traveled to Washington, D.C. last week to lobby for education issues in the Capitol. Top of the list was trying to get the withheld funding released. Tom Burns, the St. Lawrence Lewis BOCES superintendent, says the nut of the issue is this. Districts have to be able to plan ahead. This action to withhold approved funding throws them into chaos.
I mean, that's been typical of this administration. They seem to want to operate as disruptors. That's their prerogative. That's their choice. I think what we're used to in education is stability, and we are talking about kids.
On Monday, Democratic officials from 24 states and the District of Columbia sued the Trump administration for freezing the education funding. Whether that lawsuit will get money flowing before the school year begins in less than 2 months is another question mark. Amy Feiereisel, North Country Public Radio.
We have more news all the time on our website, ncpr.org. Music today by Eddie Lawrence of Saranac Lake and Evan Veenstra of Gananoque, Ontario. I'm Kara Chapman, North Country Public Radio.